20 years. Does it feel like it's been that long?
It feels like I'm getting old. That's what it means. 20 years. It's almost over a third of my life almost. With these
Stuck with us.
No, it's awful.
Feels like only yesterday.
Does
that
it?
We did that first game in 2006. You were nervous. I was nervous.
You were nervous.
He was nervous. I think we were all nervous.
Remember the water moccasins in Vero Beach? And went on that road trip in spring training?
With no commercials.
No commercials. Oh, boy.
I don't know this water moccasin story.
Oh, it was all wet, and it was Vero Beach, and we had no commercials. Gary and I had to do the whole game without a commercial. And we're back in the trailer, and I look to my left, and there's a little ditch with water, and there was a darn water moccasin in it. No thanks.
Guys, I get asked this all the time about our broadcast, and specifically the three of you. Everybody always says, what is it? Like, what if you were to put your finger on it, what is it that makes the group so special? And part of it for me is intangible. You can't really describe why it works as well as it does, but if there were one or two things that you would point to over the years, why do you think this has become what it has become?
Well, I think there's a bunch of things. I think a lot of it had to do with how we started. When we began, we were all kind of flying blind. Keith had done, a handful of games the previous few years, but hadn't really made the big dive into being a broadcaster. Ronnie had done the 1 year in Washington without a whole lot of direction, and I was coming from radio. So I felt as though none of us really knew what we were doing, so we had no choice but to hold hands in the dark and try and make our way. But the other thing, and to me it's even more stunning, because, we're talking about a guy who should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and one of the greatest pitchers in Mets history, and there's no ego. There's absolutely no ego. Every other broadcast that I am aware of, there's a need that people have to have the microphone, to be the star, to be out front. And we've never been that way. We always defer to each other, and I think that goes a long way toward explaining why it works.
Well, for me, and I've always said this, and I'm not saying it because Gary's here, this is the best play-by-play guy in the game. I've always said that Ronnie and I are members of the band, and Gary's Lawrence Welk, or,
And a one, and a two.
But Gary feeds off us and directs. He is the director. He directs the broadcast. And if I go off into orbit somewhere, he'll reel me back in. But I think the most...
Does that happen ever?
I've gotten better over the years.
Now he's only orbiting Mars rather than Jupiter.
But I think the most important thing is that we've got two parts of the game. There's pitching, that Ronnie is obviously knows things that I couldn't possibly know, and then the hitting aspect. And I think that really balances the broadcast. And with Gary, the way he orchestrates everything, and he engages us. I mean, when there was 3-hour games, we tell you, I could fall asleep once in a while. Those games were so long and boring. Gary's at his best in those games.
Good.
And he keeps us on our toes. He asks questions. I think that you fans at home, I think it enhances the broadcast. And there's no one else that does it like him.
I come from a unique place because I do other games with other people, and I have other three-man booths I'm part of. And I know people come up to me all the time and say, boy, you're so great with Keith and Gary, but, the broadcast for the other network, not so good. And it's impossible to recreate. That's how good it has become. And Keith was saying about pitching and hitting. Gary can attest to this. Right before we came on air, I don't know if it was spring training or the regular season, our first year, we were about to do the opens, like a countdown, 30 seconds will be on air. Keith goes, remember, I've got the hitting, you've got the pitching. And it was so beautiful and so simple, because that's really the problem with a three-man booth, is that people talk over each other all the time, and we don't have that. And if we do it, talk over each other, it's a shtick. We're having fun talking over each other.
This is actually a question I've never asked you guys or the guys in the truck who, they don't get as much credit as they deserve, because so much of that is due to our producer and the guys in the truck, their creativity. But was it just totally an organic thing where this broadcast became that, in a sense that, or in the sense that most broadcasts don't allow for something like that?
Well, I think a lot of the credit goes to the people we work for. I think that they have understood from the beginning that they need to let us fly a little bit. But it's also, Ronnie has said this in the past, sometimes it feels like what we're doing is a parody of a baseball broadcast. And, there's some stock in that too. If you remember, whether it was Fernwood Tonight or the Gary Shandling show, we're kind of doing a show, but we're also doing a parody of a show at the same time. And if we can get people to chuckle a little bit along with bringing them the baseball game, especially before the pitch clock, when there was so much time to fill, I think that you keep people watching longer, and that ultimately is the goal, right?
Yeah, again, I reiterate what Steve and Gary were saying. Greg Picker is our producer. John DeMarsco is our director. Tommy Rockland and Eddie Warman are the four people that travel with us. They're with us all the time. And Greg Picker, our producer, pushes us all the time to go to different. One of the toughest things in spring training is meeting with Greg, and he has a list of 100 things that he wants us to do this year, and we have to try to get it because he gets bored as well.
Ronnie, he emailed me mine.
He did
2 days ago, which
go.
is well in advance. So he's antsy now.
It's a nightmare for you.
Oh, a nightmare.
Yeah, but it's we have just become a great team together. Broadcasters are strange. We're not part of the team. We're our own entity, and we're the only teammates we have. So we kind of stick together.
Well, I think that all that stuff, the comedy that comes with it, comes naturally. But it's also, I think, our producer, Greg Picker, he's the one that really encouraged us, because we're really a local broadcast for you folks, Met fandom out there. And we've been there 20 years with a lot of kids that have grown up watching us, a lot of families. And you just can't do a staid, straight broadcast. It's a long season, as you know, 162 games. And there has to be some levity and some comedy in it. And it happens naturally. And this guy right here has a very subtle sense of humor. A wry sense of humor, which I just love. When I'm working with Gary, I like to probe him and get him to chuckle and make a comment back. So it just works great. We've been at it so long, we can do it with one arm tied behind our back.
My favorite part is Gary's so subtle, as Keith was saying, but he's so smart that there are so many times on our broadcast over the 20 years, he will say something that I know he went deep, and it takes me longer to laugh at, like oh, it's so funny, and I start laughing like it makes no sense that I'm laughing, but I had to wait because I couldn't process it all.
Both of these guys mentioned Greg Picker, and he is such a huge part of it. And I think the thing to understand about Greg is, A, he played baseball, so he really knows the game, and he pushes these guys especially to not give you the obvious answer to whatever question. He always pushes them to go to the next level, not just the what, but the why. The other piece is that Greg, before he came to us, had never done everyday baseball before. He had done either a game of the week format, or he'd done special events. He was very into tennis, did a lot of US Opens and such. So having to do baseball every day, he has a restless personality, and he gets very bored. And so that is the initiative for him to push us to go to the limits of what we do. So he gets an enormous piece of the credit.
For example, Keith knows this as well as I do. When we have to talk about something technical, I'll say it or Keith will say it, but I know I've heard this many times. I'll say it and I feel like I really nailed it, and you hear him in your ear go, what does that mean? And you feel really bad about yourself, but he makes you go a little further.
Yes, and I think in your ear is, okay, not enough, more. What do you mean? You got to give them fans more. And then you got to dig and go, okay, just like, leave me alone.
It's kind of like when I ask Keith what a hitter needs to do in a certain situation. He'll say, he needs to bear down. And I say, what does that mean, bear down?
Well,
What does it mean?
my dad, when he taught us how to two-strike hit, it was like pretend that you're a wounded animal backed up against a wall, and you got nowhere to go, and you got a mountain lion after you, and that's how you approach a two-strike hitting.
Why don't you say that on
That's
the
bear,
broadcast?
so
Why don't you say that on the broadcast?
It's not a lion, it's a bear. That's why I say bear down. Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
Steve is part of the broadcast, and he's terrific down in the sidelines. And we love and Greg encourages this, is that when we banter back and forth with Steve, we have so much fun. You know, it's whether it's an 8-0 game or there's a little interlude somewhere that we work with Steve, and Steve does such a good job. And he's down there, sitting down there in the cold. He's got to watch the game. And, all of a sudden they throw to him, and he's got to come up with stuff, and you're terrific.
I know about that. Every time I go into the cafeteria, he's in there having Shake Shack, so it's not that bad.
Well, thank you very much, Keith. Ron, I don't know. All right, last question before we get to some fan questions. So since this is a celebration of 20 years, how would you say the three of you as a broadcast team have evolved from year one to where you are right now?
Well, I'll say it's changed because we cut our teeth on 3.5-hour games. And with the pitch clock, it has changed a lot. So we've had to kind of evolve as the game has evolved. But the general premise of how we prepare for games and get ready and how we enjoy games is still the same. So I don't think it's changed that much. But the banter back and forth is less now because the game is so much quicker.
I think that it has changed somewhat because of the explosion of information that's now available. I mean, when we prep for a game, and we all prep differently, there's so many more sources of information to try and sift through. And as the technology revolution and the sabermetric revolution has evolved over the last 20 years, we've sometimes, kicking and screaming, have evolved with it and incorporated some of that into what we do. But the one thing that hasn't changed, and I know this for a fact, is that of all the people who have ever come up to me, fans, to talk about the broadcast, not a single one of them has said, you need to use more statistics. What they always ask about is the human side. What's David Wright really like? What's Carlos Mendoza really like? That's what people want. They want human stories. They want to know about the people who are playing the game. And I think that we've been true to that, and that's part of why maybe we've had to come kicking and screaming into the modern era, information-wise. But I think that that's never going to change. The human part is always the most important.
I think Ronnie nailed it. I think the biggest adjustment I think I had to make, and I think we all did, is that the games were so long in the past, and we had this, but Gary mentioned it one time. Think of it. Gary said, games used to be 2.5 hours. We're playing 3.5-hour games. That's another hour of where we got continued chatter. And that was with the pitch clock now. The big difference now is that we haven't got time to expound on something which I miss sometimes, but I'll take the 2.5-hour games, trust me. But we have to get in and out. We have to be concise more concise with our broadcast, our points that we're making, because the next pitch is on the way.
Maybe working against us, because if we have to be more quick-witted at a time in our lives when we may be slowing down a little bit,